We have been imitating nature for millions of years. So how can we come back to that, and how can we learn from nature to produce things in a much more sustainable way? We should study problem solving, and we should study biomimicry in school. Ideal or the most complicated ways are imitating processes and imitating ecosystems. Mistakes are necessary, and failure is necessary to innovate and to design something new.
Welcome back to The Change Officer. A lot of discussion is being generated today on coming up with a new design that is both sustainable and functional. But why go to other directions for inspirations when we have nature? Nature has been designing and problem solving for billions of years. From architecture to energy, we have been taking great inspiration from the natural world. The question is, why is it so hard to copy nature? In today's special episode, I am proud to welcome an award-winning designer and academic, Carlos Alberto Montana-Hoyos. Carlos is going to introduce us with a sustainable approach to innovation called biomimicry. For the past 10 years, he has been exploring the emerging discipline of biomimicry as both an evolutionary and revolutionary step for design and a necessary path to a sustainable future. Currently serving as the founding associate professor in Dubai Insitute of Design and Innovation, his scholarly publications include 2 books, numerous referred academic journals, and professional design publications. Colombian-born Australian citizen, Carlos has also lived in Italy, Japan, and Singapore, and today he will be sharing his amazing story. Welcome to The Change Officer, Carlos.
Thank you, Vuk. It's my pleasure.
Thanks for coming. We had an amazing intro chat when you introduced me more to a very interesting journey that you had before coming to UAE and then coming to the UAE and starting your new role. And you introduced me to a topic that I was honestly not familiar with before, which is biomimicry. And how biomimicry can be applied in a lot of different verticals today. And after I did some research, I almost fall in love with the idea. And that will be the subject of this podcast. We'll be talking more about that. So I'm really looking forward to that. I suggest we start by introducing our listeners to the topic of biomimicry. So can you tell us just a bit more at the basic level what biomimicry is?
Yes, of course. So basically, biomimicry comes from 2 words, bios and mimesis, Greek words. Mm-hmm. And bios is, of course, life, biology, and mimesis is to imitate. So the idea basically is to imitate nature, imitate life, imitate biology. It's also defined as innovation inspired by nature. And basically, the seminal book was written in 1997 by Janine Benyus, and she coined the term biomimicry. It's not necessarily something new. I think we have been imitating nature for millions of years, but probably what's new in biomimicry is the philosophy behind it, to use nature as model, mentor, and measure. So we have imitated nature in many ways before, but especially with the Industrial Revolution, we also have seen nature as a resource, and basically as a resource that we need to use. But what biomimicry proposes is that nature is not just resources that we can use, but is actually a very good source of knowledge and of solutions. Because the whole idea is that evolution has worked for many, many millions of years. And the species that have evolved and that have improved are living species, and what hasn't evolved basically is extinct or fossils. And this is the main premise behind biomimicry, innovation inspired by nature.
By nature, and I've listened to the TEDx show, the TED Talk actually, show that Janine did long time ago. I think it's quite old actually, the video.
Yes.
And we're going to leave the link in the description of the podcast. so everyone can see it. And she's describing, she's starting the talk, talking about some innovator, not really saying that she's referring to the nature. And, she's referring to, it's been around for some time now, I'm looking around me and this innovator is making miracles. And it really, when you think about it, it makes so much sense that the nature has been on a learning curve for the previous, how many millions of years, went through so many trials and errors to reach where it is today. And we as humans don't need to necessarily, reinvent the wheel with some of the stuff that nature already tried for us and then basically designed solution for us.
Absolutely. That's the main premise. And in a way, also the main premise is that for many years, maybe our ancestors or many indigenous tribes were very close to nature. Mm-hmm. And our ancestors actually knew how to read nature very well, how to learn from nature, and they would even be able to, let's say, smell rain and track animals, and they were very much in touch with nature. And then we have created our artificial environments, our built environments, the big cities, and we've gone far away from nature. We basically have created spaces where we completely separate ourselves from nature, and we kind of forgot that nature is there with many solutions that have evolved for a long time. And again, many times, as you say, we try to reinvent the wheel, or we rely only on new technologies, on the artificial, and especially with the Industrial Revolution. One of the parts that I like very much from Janine's book is the whole idea, for example, of manufacturing, like heat, beat, and treat. So usually industrial manufacturing is very energy consuming. It's really about processes that many times use a lot of heat, a lot of energy, use chemicals that are very toxic and very high temperatures, very high pressures to produce materials. And nature basically creates some amazing materials in water at room temperature with biological materials, biodegradable. So how can we come back to that, and how can we learn from nature to produce things in a better way, in a much more sustainable way? So it's also going, in a way, working with nature rather than working against nature. Yes.
And you were not aware of biomimicry all your life. You discovered biomimicry at certain point. What happened? How did you discover it? So we can kind of figure out how can we discover it and the rest, and bring it to surface it up now.
Yeah. So, I was trained as an industrial designer. And in industrial design, especially in the 90s and, the last century, there were some attempts to discuss innovation from nature, biomimetics, biomechanics, and other biodisciplines. So I did study a bit of biomechanics when I was in the university, applied to industrial design. It was very popular from Victor Papanek, one of the theorists of industrial design. Then I kind of, in a way, forgot it when I went into industry. You get into the traditional industrial paradigm and kind of forgot it. When I was doing my master's in Japan, basically I was thinking about the next step, and it was doing the PhD. I had done my master's in design for sustainability, and I was thinking on what could be the next step. And in a way, randomly, I was browsing a Newsweek magazine. I think that was probably 2005. And I found this article about Janine Benyus and about biomimicry. I read it and something just clicked.
That's it.
And for me, design for sustainability and biomimicry just made a lot of sense. So I managed to Yeah, well, I started studying, I read the book, I then started to get documentaries, look at other bio-inspired design fields, again, biomechanics, biodesign, biomimetics, there's many bios, and trying to understand them. And basically that was my PhD. And then since then, probably almost 15 years ago, I've been teaching it also to my students because I think it's a fantastic tool.
No, very interesting. Another area very close to your heart is design. So before we start talking about how biomimicry and design work together, can we just put the word design in the right context?
Okay.
When we say design, and it's been overly used word probably over the previous 10, 15, 20 years due to a lot of new trends. How do you describe design in its purest form?
Okay, so let me talk both about design and design thinking. That is probably what has been most popularized in the last decades in industry and innovation and entrepreneurship. So for me, well, design is is planning. I think there's this big idea of design just as planning, and you can design a policy, or you can design government, you can design education. That's basically the big interpretation of design. But of course, for me, design is around the creative disciplines: industrial design, product design, graphic design, multimedia design, architectural design. So more in terms of the built environment. But there has also been an evolution in the roles and in the interpretation of design. And also it has to do very much with the context. So probably one of the public perceptions around design is that design is making something beautiful or making something look cool. And this is especially so because we tend to associate it with designer brands in the case of fashion and accessories, or with interior design. And for example, in the region, we have like these very luxurious interior designs. So people do tend to associate it just to making things beautiful, but that's only one part of what design really is. And as designers, we tend to think that design is the humanization of technology. It's also problem solving, and it's also being able to create new businesses. So in those terms, design opens up very broadly and is not just making things beautiful. It's also thinking about how people use technology. It's also thinking about new businesses. And the other part is that design has dematerialized. So when we talked traditionally about design, we were thinking, for example, in the case of industrial product design, we were thinking of the chair, of the table, or in the case of architectural design of the house or the building. But now more and more we see that our world is digital. So all those digital interfaces, all those video games, everything has to be designed by people. So design has now dematerialized from things to services and to user experiences. So that is, let's say, the broad scope that we think about in terms of design I think nowadays.
That makes a lot of sense. So now when we put together biomimicry and design, which seems to be a very nice blend, what's the output that we are then getting?
There's many different types of outputs at many different levels. So the most basic ways of biomimicry are to imitate form or function. And that is usually related to materiality, and it's usually related to things or to products. So if we think about a robot, we could imitate the shape of a spider, for example, and that's imitating form. Or if we think, for example, about the Shinkansen, that is one of the examples in some of the YouTube videos, the bullet train in Japan. Basically, that's one of the classic examples of biomimicry, because some of the engineers were trying to reduce the drag of the bullet train in Japan, and they were trying to reduce the noise that it was producing. So they were actually looked at some examples in nature, and they found that the kingfisher, when it's diving, it almost didn't make even ripples when it dove into the water.
Wow.
Because of the aerodynamics of the beak. So they basically took this form and these function, the aerodynamics or hydrodynamics, and they translated it into a product, and they created an improved product, and that's the basis for today's bullet trains in Japan. But in a way, it's the most simple ways of biomimicry are imitating form and function, which we can see. Mm-hmm. But the ideal or the most complicated ways are imitating processes and imitating ecosystems. So imitating processes, again, when we were talking about manufacture, instead of using traditional industrial manufacture, very energy consuming, heat intense, how can we produce materials under normal conditions? And nowadays we even talk very much about growing materials. So growing artificial leathers from tea, from kombucha, or growing materials from fungi. That is very much what we're looking at now. So how can we imitate those processes in nature? Even swarm technologies, for example, when we have self-driving cars or autonomous robots and how they can communicate with each other, that comes from biomimicry and the study of the processes of communication in ants, for example, or in fish. But then the next level is how we can imitate ecosystems. And interestingly, in entrepreneurship, in businesses, we always talk about the ecosystem, the business ecosystem, but probably we don't really think about ecosystem in nature and in ecology. But if we have this systems thinking and we really think about ecosystems, then we would think in the symbiotic relationships between the different elements in this ecosystem. And probably one of the interesting examples there, and it comes from basically 20 years ago, industrial ecology. That was one of the attempts of merging also industry and ecology. Ideas like how can some of the wastes of some industries become food or become energy for other industries. So instead of competing or instead of throwing away the waste or dissipating the unused energy, how can they share these resources? And that is thinking like an ecosystem. But again, that's a higher level of complexity, because you have to understand many different elements in that ecosystem and how they interact together.
Seems like this topic is vital for a lot of different aspects of design, ecosystem design, process design, product design, but I haven't heard about it before. And I've been involved into design services quite a lot over the previous 10, 20 years. Why do you think that's the case?
Interesting. I don't know. I actually think in the last years, biomimicry has been widely advertised, but probably it's more evident within the engineering community or within the design community. Probably it's still very specialized. Yes, there have been some documentaries like the one you probably and TED Talks, and I think there is this aim to make it somewhat more popular.
Yep.
And even the Biomimicry Insitute looks at inserting it in traditional education. So as we study geography or we study biology in school, probably we should study problem solving, and we should study biomimicry in school. That's the idea, but it's in a way a movement that is growing.
No, yeah. If you think about innovation as well, which has been on as they say, which has been a part of mission statement of most of the companies, out there for the previous 20 years. Innovation has to be a part of it, but innovation is working perfectly with biomimicry if you think about it. So it's really beautiful.
Absolutely.
And then second topic that most of the big corporates out there are talking about is sustainability now. Mm-hmm. We are heading towards a lot more awareness when it comes to sustainability. Biomimicry and sustainable design that you've studied as well works in a perfect symbiosis, right?
Yes, that's the whole point. And that was my research as a PhD student, and that was the topic of my book. And the idea is that, in design for sustainability, or in general in sustainable development, we look at the three pillars, mm-hmm. and we think about people, and it's very important, and we think about the planet, and of course it is very important, and we think about the profit. It still has to make sense as a business. So the 3 Ps, for example. But in the case of biomimicry, because we're looking at nature, it ties very, very well with the environmental aspects of sustainable design. And again, in a way, biomimicry invites us to reconnect with nature and to not think about nature just in terms of resources that we need to exploit, but really in terms of a resource of knowledge and of solutions that we should keep. And that's why, again, the biomimicry thinks about respect or having nature as model, mm-hmm. measure, and mentor. And the idea of nature as measure is very important because we should respect the limits of nature, and we should respect the limits of our ecosystems. And that's basically the whole idea around climate change and the whole idea about depleting our resources. So for me, they absolutely make sense, and they go one in hand with the other.
Very interesting topic. In your book, you also wrote about biomimicry for aerospace and colonization.
Okay. Yes.
Which sounds like a very interesting topic to talk about. Can you bring us closer to what you wrote about?
Yes. So, that's actually not in this book. It's actually a very recent chapter mm-hmm. that I recently wrote with some colleagues from the Dubai Institute of Design and Innovation, and it still hasn't been published. It will be published this year. The book called Biomimicry in Aerospace, mm-hmm. and it actually has reviewers and people from NASA and from very interesting backgrounds. And in a way, what we're trying to do is to visualize the future of biomimicry and how biomimicry is evolving with technology and how that could allow us to live in Mars, for example. So biomimicry is imitating nature, but nowadays there's like other theories or other movements that are thinking probably we don't just imitate nature, probably we blend nature with technology. And those are things like next to nature or biodesign, where in a way we're fusioning the two. We're not developing a technology just by imitating nature. We're actually putting together nature and the technology. And if you think of it, more and more we're developing these new and emerging technologies, and we can't stop them. So it's not like we can completely go back to nature and stop mm-hmm. the technologies. But how can we put them together? So we use a tool called design fiction, mm-hmm. which in a way works like science fiction. And we try to imagine future scenarios. and we try to think how would biomimicry and biodesign, or the relationships between biology and technology, work for space colonization in the future, because we're seeing that the aerospace industry is one of the industries that is evolving the most nowadays, with SpaceX and Virgin and all these enterprises to have commercial flights to other planets. And we will, in the next 20, 30 years, we will be probably colonizing other planets.
Are you working closely with Elon Musk?
Not really, but we do keep an eye on what he's doing.
I'm gonna put you in touch after the show.
Fantastic.
So this is just one of the things that you teach your students at Dubai Institute for Design and Innovation.
That's right.
What are other key pillars on which you're basing the institute?
Okay, so let me just tell you a bit about DIDI, the Dubai Institute of Design and Innovation, because it's very new and probably many people don't know it. DIDI is the first specialized university here in Dubai, specialized in design and innovation. And it basically just started 3 years ago, in 2018. I have the fortune of being the first academic that arrived. I'm the founding associate professor, and I'm very proud about it.
You should be.
It's one of these, it's an opportunity of a lifetime, I guess, to start a university from scratch. And basically, what we do is that we combine design, innovation, and entrepreneurship in our studies. So most of the design schools, let's say the traditional design schools, were usually housed either in faculties of arts or in faculties of engineering and technology. And usually either the focus was completely towards the arts, and that's when we think about design more like a graphic design and nice colorful images and these kind of traditional approaches, or they were very much schools of technology, and then we talk about engineering design or product design engineering, very technology manufacturing focused. But what we're seeing is that, especially for the future, that is not enough. And the most progressive schools of design nowadays are actually being embedded or are developing from business schools. So what we're doing in DIDI is that we're basically merging the three. We're merging design, or what we call the visual literacy, with technology. We have a very strong background in technology because, again, technology is unstoppable and it's what's driving much of the new businesses. But we also have a very strong focus in entrepreneurship. And also because we believe that the jobs that we have now, probably 70-80% of those jobs will not exist in the future. Many of them would be automated. Many of them would be developed in different ways thanks to the new tools that we have: virtual reality, AI, touchable holograms. We have so many emerging technologies that are being developed that our world is going to change completely. And that's what we're training our students for. So we don't train them in the traditional, let's say, graphic design or product design or even fashion design. We're getting them to merge those disciplines. So our students choose 2 of 4 disciplines, which are basically product design, multimedia design, strategic design management, and fashion design. So they need to choose at least 2. And this interdisciplinarity, we think, is going to be very important. And again, we're training them as entrepreneurs with a very strong technological background. And of course, with the human part or the emotional part that design brings to the mix.
I think that's a very relevant blend of skills that future leaders should have. And I think that the moment when you started the institute it's a really good timing. So I'm looking forward to see the outputs of the future generations that you will be rolling out.
We're also looking forward to it. We're hopefully graduating our first cohort in 2022.
Okay.
So we currently have 3 years. But again, we're in 3 years, some of our students are already developing some amazing projects. We recently had a group of second-year students that just moved to their third year, but they're already receiving money from investors to develop a new material that they started experimenting with in one of their classes. So we're seeing very, very interesting results. And of course, we're curious also to see what our students will do in the future. Very proud, very proud.
All right, switching gears now a bit. You have a very interesting life journey. You lived around the world, from Colombia, Italy, Japan, Singapore, Australia, and then eventually you are now in UAE. What kept you going, man?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. And well, probably a long story short, since I was a kid, I always dreamed of traveling the world and about learning of different cultures. And especially, because I'm a designer, since I was also a student in the university and even in high school, I used to look at books and used to look at museums or architectural icons or cities. And I always thought, I want to go someday and actually experience and live in these places. And fortunately, I started to travel when I was probably 23 years old, and I haven't stopped. So yes, a Colombian born, and being an industrial design student, I got an opportunity to do an internship in Italy, near Switzerland, Casinetta di Biandrono, and also near Milano. And again, that was a dream come true because it was the first time I left my country and I went to Italy, one of the big cities of design. I managed to visit as many museums as I wanted. It was a great cultural experience. Then I went back to my country, to Colombia. I finished my studies. I worked in industry as an industrial designer, product designer for probably around 9 years. And when I was working in one of the companies, I started teaching part-time in a local university in a product design engineering course. And I started to realize that I was enjoying more the teaching than even the industrial practice. Since I was a kid, I loved teaching and explaining things to my classmates. And this was an eye-opener, so I started to look for ways of studying abroad, of doing my postgrads. And I was, by the time, married to my wife, who has always been very supportive in this journey. And I knew about a scholarship in Japan, a scholarship by the Japanese government. And I thought I'll give it a try just to know what it takes and to find what's the paperwork that you have to do. But I really never thought I would get it. It was just a trial. I thought I would need to try many times. And my wife did tell me, no, you'll get it and we'll end up moving to Japan. And eventually that was what happened. So we moved to Japan and lived there for some years. Afterwards, I did my master's and I was going for my PhD, basically because I wanted to continue in academia. And I received an offer to start teaching as a junior academic in Singapore. So that's when we moved to Singapore. There, after some years, my daughter was born. And then I received the opportunity to go to Australia. And in Australia, we lived for 8 years and we became Australian citizens. And now we're here in the UAE,
in the UAE.
and in Dubai.
That's
Yes.
quite a journey from Colombia to Japan. That's far away from home. Is it? Maybe it's going to be a stupid question, but as they say, there is no stupid questions.
Yes.
How do you fly from Colombia to Japan? Or on which side do you take?
Okay, at the time it was basically going to the US, and then from the US going to Japan.
Okay.
So usually, yes, to Colombia, most of the flights have to go to the US. Yes. But funny enough, for example, from Australia, now, most of the flights went through New Zealand and Chile. And then they would go up to Colombia.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's an interesting question. That's a funny question.
I was kind of, it was risky asking the questions because maybe, there is a very obvious answer.
No.
All right. My next question is, we as humans are shaped by our experiences. You've been around the world. You've been through a lot of different countries, a lot of different cultures. You met a lot of people. What are some of the experiences in your life that influenced you the most?
Traveling and living in different cultures. So I think that once you start traveling, you learn from different cultures and you adopt some elements or some customs of some countries that you like, of course. And of course, there will always be things that you don't quite understand and you don't like. Definitely, my first trip, because it was the first and it was Europe. But again, Europe, Latin America, very similar cultures. So one of the massive learning experiences was being in Japan, definitely. And also because it was a massive culture shock. When I arrived, I didn't quite speak the language. I had just taken some basic courses. I knew how to say konnichiwa, watashi wa Carlos desu, and that was it. Probably just the very, very basics. And there's a big cultural shock there, and especially when there's a language barrier. But Japan is such an amazing culture.
What do you think was the most important lesson, or what was the best thing that you learned from Japanese culture?
In a way, to be again like a child and to observe things because of the language barrier. So many times when you handle the language or you're in your own country, you get to a point where you're not surprised by things anymore. And you don't observe things so carefully because you rely very much on written information or on verbal information. But when you're in a country where you cannot read anything or when you cannot communicate verbally with the people, that makes you much more observant. So you need to be creative in terms of how you communicate, and you need to look at the things in much more detail. So for example, going to the supermarket and you saw some things that you didn't know if it was an animal, a plant, because they were completely different foods and all the characters were the Japanese characters. So you have to become much more observant. And I think that's a very good quality for designers and in general for entrepreneurs. We need to be very observant of people, and we need to empathize with people and try to understand people. So for me, that was a massive learning.
Wow, that's quite interesting. You read a lot. When we had a initial conversation, I saw the whole bookshelf in the back with hundreds and thousands of books. What is the book that you've given most as a gift in your life?
That's a very interesting question, difficult question. Well, probably my book. I gave it as a gift to many of my colleagues and to universities where I had worked before. But other than
or what are some of the books that greatly influenced your life?
Yes,
that you would
My life, well, when I was a kid, I think that Robinson Crusoe and some of the Jules Verne books were definitely in the top list. Then as a teenager, I was very much into Richard Bach and some of these ideas probably around spirituality. Massive fan of Umberto Eco. So probably one of the books that I really enjoyed the most reading was The Name of the Rose. Recently, I've actually been reading Yuval Noah Harari, and I'm currently going through Sapiens, and it's a very interesting, very entertaining story. But well, I did it the wrong way, but I first read the 21 lessons for the 21st century, and for me it was so relevant, and especially because thinking about design and thinking about the future, that also was a very important book recently. But again, I think probably every stage of life has one or two books that resonate a lot in you. In my university, definitely Victor Papanek's book was key, but then classics, I guess.
Yeah. No, interesting. Most of the people would, and I would be the first one to respond with some of the books that I've recently read about business or mindfulness. But actually, if you think about it, there's a lot of these books that we read when we were a lot younger, that actually shaped us into who we are in some parts today.
Yes, absolutely.
There is this global movement. It's called How I F Word Up. And basically, are you familiar with it?
Yes. I've seen it. I haven't read it, but I've seen it.
They're celebrating failures, right? So in the world where everyone is going around spreading, awareness about their successes, they are counterbalancing with celebrating failures, because at the end of the day, there's a lot more failures, I think, in our lives than successes, and that's where we learn the most. What do you think was a failure in your life, or apparent failure, that set you up for a later success?
That's an interesting question. Well, first of all, let me start by saying that I agree with you. I think we've been, or our society is looking so much into success and into a definition of success that we're missing many aspects of life. And on the other hand, I think, as I was saying, that evolution is a series of errors or mistakes, even mutations. Sometimes are errors that become very interesting things. And the whole process of design is a process of trial and error. And you need to make many mistakes very quickly to be able to improve something. So for me nowadays, and what we try to teach to our students, is that mistakes are necessary, and failure is necessary to innovate and to design something new, and to grow as a person. It's part of our lives. We shouldn't try to hide it. Of course, I've made many mistakes, and I'll have many failures. Probably I can remember two concrete ones. When I was an industrial designer for a furniture factory, we were commissioned to design some custom-made furniture. And basically, I went by the book. So I took the ergonomics books and with all the standards, and I took all the measurements, and I said, this design has to respect all the measurements of the ergonomics books. And that was the design of the chair. The carpenters fabricated the chair. It was all according to standards and measures. And then when we tried it it was the most uncomfortable chair that we've ever tried. And of course, the client was very pissed off and was trying to give back these chairs because they were very uncomfortable. And we were trying to justify that we had, followed the rules by the book. But that just teaches you that we can't just follow rules by the book, that we can't just follow the standards, especially if we're innovators or designers, and that we always need to test things. And that was in terms of a product.
I think that was a great lesson.
Yeah, it was a great lesson, and definitely, fortunately, it was a small commission. It was not a massive industrial production. Now, another lesson in education was basically when I moved from Singapore to Australia, and it was basically lack of empathy and lack of understanding my customers or my users who were my students. So, of course, I came with a certain mindset and a certain cultural and background and work background in Singapore. And when I arrived in Australia, in a way, I assumed that all the students all around the world are identical. And I set the same expectations that I was setting to my students in Singapore to my Australian students. And that was a big no-no because the students in Australia were very different, from very different backgrounds. Many were mature students, and studying in a university was not their only activity. Many were working, had families, a complete different context. And of course, when they saw this volume of work that I was demanding, they reacted very harshly. And at the beginning, I had some very poor student reviews where previously I was winning teaching awards and these kind of things. And it just made me learn that, again, the one-fits-all approach never works. And especially with people, we need to empathize and we need to understand people.
Those are two quite interesting lessons. I like them, and I'm sure that this. How did you apply the learning later on in your life?
Well, again, I usually always try to use empathy. Mm-hmm. As a designer, we talk about user-centered design or customer-centered design. And as a person, I always try really to understand people, to understand what are their needs, what are their wants, to empathize, to be able to work with these people. And I think that's also the basis of co-creation nowadays and of innovation, really to get all the minds together and be able to co-create. So I try not to assume things or not to probably just think about stereotypes or what appears is obvious, but try to dig a bit more.
That's interesting. There is another interesting book that sets up the good stage for the next question, and it's written by Ray Dalio. Whether you're familiar with him or not, for the listeners, I think they already heard about it in previous episodes, but he is one of the most wealthiest people in the United States. He owns and manages the largest hedge fund in the world, and he wrote the book Principles. And in this book, he summarizes his life and work principles that he kind of stick to over his long career, and obviously a successful one. And it's a fantastic book. And then he's giving examples. There's more than 100 principles that he is kind of following in his life. And for example, some of the life principles are embrace reality and deal with it, or be radically open-minded, which is interesting. Or two work principles are radical truthfulness and radical transparency. When you think about some of the principles that you've been kind of sticking to in your life, would you be able to
yes, that's
to come up with some now?
It's a surprise question. Let me think a bit about it. Of course, I think that there's principles in our lives and what guides us. Well, talking about biomimicry, I think that biomimicry has some very interesting principles that I personally apply in my life. So trying to understand what are some of the principles of life or in nature. And one of them is that nature is opportunistic. It doesn't plan a lot. It basically tries to adapt to the situation. And I in a way, have been very much like that. Yes, I think that planning, of course, is very important, but sometimes you just need to be opportunistic and adapt to situations, be very flexible. And I think that's also part of, having traveled a lot and lived in many different cultures. I think you learn about cultural awareness and flexibility there.
But it's interesting because a first example that I give from Ray Dalio is embrace reality and deal with it.
Yes.
Which is actually what you just described.
Which is basically
makes 100% sense.
Adapt to your surroundings. We can change many things, but we cannot change or control everything. And especially we cannot change culture. For example, we cannot pretend that we go to a different country and we change the culture of the country. So probably we need to embrace it and adapt and maybe bring some new things. For me, respect and tolerance are definitive. Of course, being Colombian, I have been the target of many nasty jokes all over the world and all the bad press about the country and in a way discriminated. So I think that we need to be absolutely tolerant and respectful with other people, no matter race, gender, political views, religion. I think respect is fundamental. Passion and love what you do. I think it's also fundamental, and I think I'm very lucky because I love teaching and I love design and I really love what I do. And even so, sometimes it can become difficult, or of course we have our stressful moments, but very fortunately I think that loving what you do really helps. Probably there's 3 principles there.
These are good ones. These are good ones. Given the fact that I surprised you with a question, I think you handled it quite well, and I agree with you, and I empathize with you as well because I come from Serbia, so there is also I've been also facing a lot of opinions, let's say, but being respectful and appreciating everyone's background is I think it's fundamental.
Absolutely.
And we're lucky that we're living in a country where there is so many different nationalities and cultures. Absolutely. And we have a chance to learn.
Yes.
learn to be like that,
from all the different cultures, because I think we can always learn best practices from different cultures and countries. I think we're always learning, and that's the beauty also of traveling around and of globalization.
Yes, definitely. Another question. What are some of the things that scares you the most in life?
Scare. That's a tough question. Probably the idea of feeling that you went through life and didn't do enough of whatever it is, of what I don't even really know how to define it, but probably yes, the idea of thinking that you have a mission in life as a person, and did you really fulfill it or not? I think that's a bit of a worry. But again, I think that's probably something that many of us deal with, trying to improve or become better. That also motivates us to improve. I'm worried to see if we will be able to control climate change and to really avoid destroying our planet and to have a future for our kids and for our grandkids in the planet. When I have an 11-year-old daughter, and when I think about the future for her, I think it's going to be very complicated. And I hope not, and probably I'm hopeful that we will be able to change our world for good. But still, it is a bit of a worry what type of world our kids are going to live in. How difficult is it going to be? That's probably also another worry or something that scares me a bit in life.
And to wrap up, as the change officer, if you could change one thing in the world, what would that be?
Well, I think basically not one thing, but many things. But probably the key thing is mentalities or the ways people think. I think we need to evolve the way we think about other people, the way we think about resources, the way we think about businesses. I think we all need to change and evolve the way we think to hopefully all create a better planet for ourselves and for our kids. Change of mindset.
Carlos, thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you very much, Vuk. It's been my pleasure.
I enjoyed the conversation thoroughly. I hope that you guys enjoy it as well, and that Carlos managed to provide you with at least that one epiphany, aha moment in this episode. If you like what we're doing here with the Change Officer, please like and subscribe. Leave any questions and comments that you have for Carlos and me. We'll be happy to reply. And see you next Monday when we are coming out with a new episode of the Change Officer. Carlos, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Vuk. My pleasure.